Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film The Last Gangster from 1937. And this is continuing my quest to review all of the films directed by William A. Wellman as I possibly can. And this film is actually not directed by William Wellman. It's actually directed by Edward Ludwig, but it's actually written by William A. Wellman. It's the only time Wellman wrote a film that he did not direct, actually. So I thought it would be interesting, at least, to look up on this film. Now, I had originally been told, and I guess heard not looked up on this film, that he had written the script, and he had written a script and a version of it at a certain point, and MGM bought it, but it was actually the screenplay that was used within this film was written by John Lee Mahine, I think. He just gets a story credit with Robert Carson. So I am assuming they did a couple drafts and he did the initial draft with Robert Carson. But nonetheless, since it is kind of unique in his filmography, I thought it was worth looking at. And this film was actually sold as being the last of all gangster films, like the final gangster film. After the early 30s were known for their violent gangster films, certainly Wellman had a part in that with Public Enemy, and Edward G. Robinson certainly had a part in that with Little Caesar. They kept advertising this in Variety as this is going to be the last gangster picture, and Edward G. Robinson had actually turned down a ton of gangster pictures before this. He didn't really like doing all those gangster pictures, and he had finally gotten a good contract at Warner Brothers and was starting to get some money and respect as an actor, but he kept getting gangster scripts, and he didn't really like any of them. They were just terrible scripts, but he liked the idea of this movie. And I think in a way this is kind of like a gangster finding redemption. It shows the difference between the early 30s and the later 30s. The 30s is a decade that had so much social and economic change and cultural change and even film technology change. It's really probably one of the most interesting decades of the 20th century. But you can really tell the kind of films and the morals of the people making those films if you compare this to like something like Public Enemy. And I think that's probably what drew Edward G. Robinson to this film, and what's made this film a little interesting and made people still wondering about The Last Gangster because of really the time it represents and how things had changed through the gangster pictures. It's almost kind of, I guess, sort of, but not really, like the gangster picture version of Unforgiven. Now, frankly, it's not The Last Gangster picture. There will always be gangster pictures, but it is kind of sort of like a finale to a genre that had started 7 years earlier or so. Although I think White Heat probably is the more memorable version of something like that, like someone returning to a gangster picture. An actor like James Cagney, who was known for the gangster picture at the beginning of the 30s, returning as an older gangster. I think White Heat's probably the more memorable one, but I think The Last Gangster says more about the change in time and the change in morals through the beginning of the 30s, which are really just towards the end of Prohibition, at the beginning of the Great Depression. A lot of things were different, and this is America slightly coming out of it. The New Deal's happened, World War II is about to start, and people are a little more morally and socially conscious about those things. Also, the people making it had grown up a lot too. Specifically, I think Edward G. Robinson and Wellman, and that certainly changed things in the way they were going to tell stories. A gangster named Joe Korzak, played by Edward G. Robinson, who's a big gangster in town and has recently married a woman from, I believe he's Polish in this film, but he's married a woman from Europe who doesn't know a lot of English, and he's starting to get in trouble by the law, who eventually arrests him for tax evasion, the very famous way to catch gangsters in the 30s, because they could never catch them with anything else, so why not tax evasion? So they do, and he goes to jail, and she's actually pregnant with their firstborn child, and she finds out that he's actually not this great guy she thought he was, and that he's a gangster, and he's killed all these people, and he's a pretty horrible guy, and all this stuff. And she decides to divorce him, and then eventually marries another man, played by Jimmy Stewart, actually, in an early role that was actually one of his first major roles at MGM, which would eventually lead to him becoming a movie star, but this was an early first step. It's also one of the few times he wears a mustache, which he decided never to do again until like the 70s. I didn't think he looked as ridiculous as he thinks, but whatever. But anyway, so Jimmy Stewart and Joe Korzak's ex-wife decide to raise Joe Korzak's son as their own son, and then Joe Korzak, after he gets out of his decade-long prison sentence, decides to try to see his son, and then these criminals kidnap his son because they know it's the only way he will talk to tell film where he hid all that money, all the millions he had as a gangster. And so now Joe Korzak needs to meet his son after he is released by these gangsters, and they're trying to find their way out of the woods to finally get home to his ex-wife and Jimmy Stewart. And the son, who's very much a Boy Scout, a literal Boy Scout, and not a gangster at all. And the definite cultural difference between the two of them. Really how The Last Gangster happened and how it was not developed as a William Wellman picture is really because Wellman and Woody Van Dyke, who were both directors at MGM at the time, were brought up to Louis B. Mayer's office and told that he thought that he was their general and they were his sergeants, and they were there to whip all these other directors into shape because those two guys could make pictures faster and under budget better than anybody, and that he wanted them to like make all these directors better directors. Wellman and Van Dyke hated the idea. Wellman basically said, "You're not going to make me your Fink." And then of course they were both paid assignment fees, but they weren't assigned actually anything. And during that time off, Wellman decided that since he was bored and Wellman always liked to be working on something, he would start writing screenplays. And with Robert Carson, he decided to write The Last Gangster, which was the first one he wrote. This is kind of a weird fact that there is actually a time that I know he was developing a film called Another Public Enemy, and in some places this film was actually called Another Public Enemy. Now this is not actually at Warner's, and I believe he wanted to develop Another Public Enemy at Warner's. So maybe it's just a coincidence, maybe it's the same story he was trying to pitch to make another gangster film. It's really his only other gangster film after Public Enemy. So I'm not sure how related this film was to that one. I don't think it's probably supposed to have been the same character or anything silly like that. I don't know anything about Another Public Enemy that he pitched. I just know he was considering making it and he did not. And since this film was actually called that in some places, it leads me to believe that this might have been that film, but I don't know. But the other screenplay that Wellman wrote after this film with Robert Carson was A Star Is Born. So in a way, what happened with Mayer kind of worked out for Wellman because he ended up writing A Star Is Born, and actually that's how he won his first Oscar. He didn't actually get an Oscar for winning Best Picture with Wings. His first and only Oscar was for actually writing A Star Is Born. It's interesting that that started that career, but this is kind of, I guess, the odd sidestep of that whole thing. This is actually also the film that Woody Allen goes and sees in the film Crimes and Misdemeanors, and during a really great sequence that shows like how long the prison sentence is. The director of this film, Edward Ludwig, is not someone I'm familiar with at all, and most of the time I was kind of trying to pick out like what could possibly have been Wellman, and there's certain coincidences. Certainly there's a lot of rain sequences, there's a certain amount of sentimentality, there's the idea of sentimentality completely falling apart, certainly how experimental some of the montages could be, but to my understanding Wellman had actually nothing to do with directing this movie. But the montages in this film are rather good. At certain points Edward Ludwig is very inspired, like you'll watch certain sequences and go, man, he's actually really good in this. Like how surprising and how visual and how smartly conveyed some of his montages are. He's always like cut to the point in certain sequences. There's one part where all the criminals are about to go into jail and he said you can have free conversation for 5 minutes, but after that you can only talk when spoken to, and they all just sit there in silence at the shock of that they're all going into prison. And that was a really depressing sequence. I've seen prison films before that are a lot more modern, and that scared the shit out of me more than any of the other ones have before. There are a lot of really haunting jail sequences that scare me probably more than I've seen from any other jail sequence in a film before. How shocking a lot of that was. I think it definitely makes you feel for all the criminals in this film. It makes you feel bad that they're stuck in this situation, that something like this exists. It really doesn't make prison look appealing at all. Not that they should. Those parts were really very good, but then there's other parts with Edward Ludwig where it just feels like they just put the camera there and hoped Edward G. Robinson would get certain shots to work. He overdoes it with the mediums and close-ups. He just feels like kind of a standard studio director. He didn't feel certainly inspired or masterful in his direction. Edward G. Robinson is trying to make up and make a really great role out of a film that I don't think has as great of a role as he's made it out to be. In certain times that really works for the film, and other times because it's like, okay, you didn't really have the direction to get this to work as well as it really should. I wish Wellman had gotten to direct this, because there's certain sequences that are just a lot more boring, because you can tell Edward Ludwig just doesn't care as much. There's certain sequences that honestly felt like they were like, okay, we need to go to lunch, but we want to get this shot, so Edward can do this in 2 takes. Kind of takes the life out of the whole thing when you see certain shots like that, because you'll see a really great montage sequence. The one where it just shows, like, you know, it goes days go down the screen and then says weeks, months, and then years, which is the sequence in Crimes and Misdemeanors. That was really stirring. That sequence is probably always going to stick with me. All the jail stuff, it's like unforgettable. Edward G. Robinson, I think, is such a great actor. I mean, he's a great character actor, but he's an amazing lead actor. In the sequences that are really well directed, particularly at the end of the film, I think he's just amazing in how little he does and how smart he is at what he's doing. Especially with the few scenes he has with Jimmy Stewart, it's pretty clear Jimmy Stewart knows, like, I can't play the heavy against this guy. It certainly works for the scene, but there's certain parts where I think, like, he knew, like, I'm just gonna step out of your way because you're Edward G. Robinson, and he proves it in this film. That's the interesting thing about gangster films, is you think of the best guys who played gangsters throughout cinema history, and you're looking at some of the best actors that the movies have ever had to offer. He brings a remorse to the role that a lot of actors would play up, like how different they are between the son and the gangster father, and that's certainly something you would have to play off of, but he plays like a remorse in a way like he knows he can't do this. I think that's certainly something within the story, but the way Edward G. Robinson plays it, he kind of tries to mask the fact, but he knows it throughout the entire film. It really helps the ending so much. Like, I think Edward G. Robinson understands one of the biggest parts of acting, like if it's in theater or film, is you're really telling part of the story. You're kind of a storyteller with the film. And Edward G. Robinson, he got that as well as any great actor should, and he was able to do that. And there's a lot of subtle things he's doing early on that just really make this movie pop. I don't know if I'd necessarily recommend The Last Gangster. It's not my favorite gangster picture. There are certain things I like about it, but there's certain weakness in the direction that definitely hurt it. If you're interested in Edward G. Robinson, I would recommend it, or you're interested into gangster pictures. I would also think, you know, on the Wellman side of things, and clearly that's why I'm reviewing this movie, it's interesting to see Wellman purely as a screenwriter, or I guess a story by credit person. And it's interesting to see how many of the Wellman trademarks are in there, but also because I think, you know, he had really grown up at this point. He was married to his wife Dottie, who he remained married to till the end of his life, and how this is more about children and more about him being a husband and a father, whereas Public Enemy is more about him being a son. And I think that shift has a lot to do with him growing up. And you see the difference in his films as the end of his pre-code period was the beginning of his relationship with his wife. This is past that, and you see once he's gotten past the pre-code period, he becomes a little less fidgety, like he's calmed down a bit. And this is like him looking back at the gangster era and saying something with it as a more mature, I think, storyteller. I think that's actually what makes The Last Gangster work, is that if it was trying to reclaim things that Public Enemy and The Little Caesar did, it wouldn't be what it is. It needs to really say something about the gangster picture, looking back at it from 37. Now, it wasn't long enough to like be nostalgic, but it was an interesting juxtaposition to look back on it. And in that way, I think it actually works, but it's not a gangster picture like Public Enemy and Little Caesar and Scarface and stuff are fun movies, and they're movies I would watch. Like, I'm not a big Little Caesar person, but they're movies I would watch, you know, every now and then, and I don't think I'd really want to watch The Last Gangster again, but it was still a fine motion picture, and I like how it exists within the columns of film history. Edward G. Robinson found a juicier gangster part, something he could do a little bit more with. A lot of people who worked on this film were trying to prove something with it, and I think they did prove it. It's not an entertaining prove it to watch. It's just like, okay, you guys proved it, and you all moved on to bigger and better things, but there's probably a reason no one's heard of this movie. It's probably honestly now more well known for being that movie Woody Allen watches in Crimes and Misdemeanors more than anything. I still think it's a fine motion picture, and it's the kind of smarter, kind of written and made gangster picture than it probably has any right to be, and that's probably how it works as well as it does. It has some really great sequences in it, and it's certainly a really memorable sidestep in film history, or even think the gangster picture was over completely, like they kind of acted like it would in the ad campaign. So if you have seen The Last Gangster and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And check out my William Wellman review playlist. There will be an annotation below. I have over 60 William Wellman reviews in that playlist, so if you're a fan of William Wellman's, there's a lot for you to watch within that playlist. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.